I'm Rachel Burley. I'm the Chief Publications Officer for the American Physical Society, and I'm going to moderate this illustrious panel here. So just to introduce the panel, Susan King, who's the Executive Director of Rockefeller University Press. We have Collette Bean, who is the Chief Publishing Officer for the American Physiological Society. Penelope Lewis, Chief Publishing Officer for AIP Publishing, and Curtis Brundy, who's the Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Communications and Collections at Iowa State University. Nice to meet you. We haven't actually met yet. So our panel session is meant to run for 70 minutes. We may need to condense that a bit just to stick to the timing. And our topic is access and evolving business models. The format will be that we will give short statements at the beginning on this topic from each of us. And that should take no longer than 25 to 30 minutes. And then what we'd like to do is spend the rest of the time engaging with you and hearing your questions on the topic that we're covering. So essentially, the focus of the discussion is around how the evolving and shifting business models are impacting academic and research publishing, and the shift from subscription-based to open access publishing, what impacts is that having and how it's transforming communications. We want to think about the impact that that's having on the research availability, what the new models that are emerging, how successful are they, how feasible are they, and also just what is the long-term sustainability of these approaches. So I'll shortly hand over to the panel to sort of give us their statements, but just to start off with my own short opinion on this is, my society, the American Physical Society, publishes the prestigious Physical Review family of journals. And those journals have been around since, well, the Physical Review, the original journal, launched in 1893. So this is a very historical and prestigious brand. In fact, the journal predates the society, and it was originally managed by Cornell. And then the APS, which was founded in 1899, took it over, and we now have 17 journals in that family, and we publish about 20,000 papers in physics and the adjacent fields a year. We do have one Diamond OA journal, we have 7 open access journals, and then 9 hybrid journals, so we've got a variety of models. And actually, my opinion on this topic is that we are now in a situation where there's going to be a mixed economy for the foreseeable future. This is my humble opinion. Obviously, I'm happy to be challenged on this. I think we've heard a lot from the speakers already this morning about what the push towards gold open access has led to. I think we're at least a decade into the sort of strong push that originated in Europe and the UK, where there were mandates there. And I think it's long enough now for us to see what the impact of that has been. And we've heard some of the impacts. It's led to a volume-based system, essentially, which was not how it started out. It started out being a highly selective process where journals' jobs was to pick the best. And we're now in a volume-based game where everything is published. And I'm not making a statement about that, it's just that's where we are, and it's led to the things that we know around the peer review crisis to some extent, and also the research integrity issues that we face. So there isn't currently a global consensus on what the optimum model is. It would be so easy if everybody globally just said, right, let's just move to this model. It's going to work for all of us. It isn't the case. As we all know, there isn't an open access policy in China, and for many of us, that's one of our biggest markets. And I think the views in the US that the OST policy is more of a public access than an open access policy. It's not stressing, the APC gold model. And I think for publishers, that has created complexity. And we're a very small scholarly society, just the 17 journals. We don't have, huge sales teams. We don't have, offices in every country. We're here in the US. And I think that this is the thing that's the problem, is the winners and losers scenario, and maybe we can talk some more about that. But I think, the idea that there's money in the system and we just need to shift it around is actually a little bit naive, because the money in the system isn't in the right places. And I think a lot of the thinking that we heard in back 10 years ago in Europe was about, well, let's just shift it all about because it's all there. Now, what we know is it doesn't work, because the institutions who are reading are not necessarily publishing. The countries with the greatest research output are now finding that they're going to be footing the bill, and they don't necessarily like it. And then there's the free riders problem that we just heard a little bit about with the previous talk. My sort of question really for us to think about is, what are the implications of supporting these mixed models indefinitely? It's not just for us that it's complex, and by us I mean the smaller not-for-profit publishers. It's complex for libraries as well, and institutions. How can they possibly do the long tail of read and publish or transitional agreements? We can't, and I'm pretty sure many are struggling with that as well. The commercial publishers, actually, and I've worked for two, and I'm not going to knock them, they were both great organizations to work for, but they're really, really good at thinking long-term and strategically. And what they do is scenario modeling to figure out, if we do this, what are all the possibilities over the next decade that could happen as a result? That is a very wise thing to do, and we've seen the result of that, is they've actually done very well out of it, because they figured out, with all of their strategists and all of their resources, how can we turn this to our advantage so that we can continue to thrive? And they are continuing to thrive. And I think the impact for others who don't necessarily have those resources is that we're disadvantaged. So in my opinion, I think we need to think about doing scenario modeling for any of the policies or models that we come up with as an industry or as a group of people who have a stake in this. Is like, what is the knock-on impact of this going to be, not just next year, but in 10 years' time? Because what we've seen is that the knock-on impacts are significant, but they don't emerge for quite some time. They don't emerge immediately. So I think we need to do... I'd like to see more research into this future scenario modeling for each of the publication models that are proposed, Subscribe to Open being one, Diamond OA. It seems like we've got a Diamond OA journal, doesn't cover its costs. So I don't see that being a sustainable model for the whole industry. So I think we need to really think about what research needs to be done, what data do we need to understand for each of these models what the future impacts will be. So I will hand over to Curtis, if that's okay, to give your statement and your question.
Yeah, thank you. And it sounds like my mic is on. Well, thank you, Amy, for inviting me to be here today. This is a great conversation. And I think it's a timely conversation. So Iowa State is I would describe us as a mid-sized research university in the U.S. And I think the comments I decided to focus on today, I work with folks all around the world on these issues, but I thought it'd be helpful today just to talk about our experience at our library, how we're dealing with the questions around these models. So Iowa State was an early adopter of open access agreements and advocate for going this direction. In fact, we were the second institution in the US after MIT to make one of these open access agreements. And I've described for many years our approach as being multimodal. There are lots of different approaches. There's lots of different organizations we need to make agreements with. We've done APC-based agreements. We do lots of non-APC-based agreements. We're a very strong supporter of Subscribe to Open. I still feel out of the community that is the best thing that we have come up with. It is not a silver bullet. It's not going to work for every use case, but it solves a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about and hear about today. So in the US, I think something that's very interesting, the consortia in Europe have been driving the agreements for many years, but it's really just recently that in the US, adoption is really skyrocketing. So I would say the first 5 years of us making these agreements, they were all direct. And it was a lot of one-on-one conversations with us actually helping the publisher sort out what the model was even going to be, like a lot of education going both directions. And to me, that's been like one of the most rewarding and good things to come out of this whole transition. It really broke down that barrier, that transactional barrier that kind of stood between institutions, libraries, and publishers. So what we're seeing now is the consortia are on the move. It's not just the CDL, it's the Big Ten. It's the Greater Western Library Alliance. That's our main consortium. We had 2 open access agreements come across the bow this week at my library that we're considering doing. So if you think about the scaling of that, it's moving fast. And all of you who are on the publisher side who are driving these agreements in the US, I think you know that. But what's curious about that is like everybody's making these agreements, but none of us know where this is going. There's some, I think if you poll the room, there's some of us would say this is a little bit better and that's a little bit better, but there's not a lot of agreement. I think there's a real lack of consensus on what the transition needs to look like. And for that reason, something we've been talking a lot about in my library is we're entering into the 2nd and sometimes the 3rd generation of these agreements is how do we assess these things? How are we to gauge our progress at our institution with our values and our goals and what we want to accomplish? Like if you've moved in the circle of the OA 2020 consortia and libraries, it's very common to see, you know, Ralph Schimmer back before the pandemic, he would put up his pie chart showing the Max Planck's progress toward the open transition. Here's this agreement. All those pie slices were getting changed toward different colors of open access. And we started doing that. So how are we going to mark our progress? We're going to track how many of the corresponding authored articles coming out of our campus are we making open access. And I think we probably are somewhere around 25%, and that number has not been moving, but we have stopped using that number. Like when we think about assessment, is that really getting at anything beyond, you know, just making more and more agreements without thinking and treating all of them the same? And they're not all the same. All of these different types of models are not taking us to the same place. So assessment is like a big one in the library community. I think a lot of libraries are still in their first generations of these, so they haven't gone through renewals, so they, you know, that maybe the budget cut hasn't happened where you got to stack these up against one another and figure out, you know, which ones are better for your institution than others. So when I think about a research agenda on the library side, I feel like this whole assessment question, and do we have the data that we even need to be able to evaluate these things and determine if they're taking us in the direction of travel we want to go? And then I'm just going to mention 3 other quick things. I think we'll get into all of these a little bit later, but 3 other things I'm thinking about. I feel like with the open access agreements and the models, I feel like we've jumped from like one critical issue we focus on to the next. I feel like before the pandemic, it was all about financial sustainability. You know, can we afford it? Is it going to bankrupt the society? So where it was financial sustainability. Then George Floyd, and it was all about equity. You know, are we going to be able to pursue an equitable approach with the things that we're doing? Well, then the last couple years, it's been the paper mill crisis and the publishing integrity questions, the research integrity questions. And as we hopscotch through these like critical questions, we haven't answered any of them. Like, they're all still sitting there. The financial sustainability question's sitting there. The equity questions are still sitting there. And absolutely, the publishing integrity questions are sitting there. We're still in the midst of that crisis. And in some ways, I mean, they're all serious. And in some ways, I feel like the publishing integrity one has taken up a lot of my attention lately because I just feel like we're in a society that can't agree on facts. And that we are contributing to polluting science with junk articles. So everybody, if you bring up evidence today, you know, everybody is justified in saying, you know, that's fake, that's a fake paper. I mean, they can dismiss everything. And we have contributed to that. Like with these agreements that we're making, we have contributed to the pollution of science. And it's just as serious as it gets. So again, thrilled that you convened the conversation, Amy and Nick. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Curtis. Susan.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. Thank you. Second, thank you very much, Amy, for this opportunity, and thank you for being part of this illustrious panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our journal program, our editorial process, a little bit of our history of public and open access and where we're headed. So I'm Susan King. I'm the Executive Director of Rockefeller University Press. We publish 4 biomedical journals, 3 hybrid journals, which are fully owned by Rockefeller University, Journal of Cell Biology, Journal of General Physiology, and Journal of Experimental Medicine. And we also publish a Gold OA journal, Life Science Alliance, that is co-owned with Cold Spring Harbor and Embo Press. RUP is a department of Rockefeller University, which I'm sure many are aware is a private biomedical research and graduate-only university in New York, focusing primarily on the biological and biomedical sciences. And, you know, as a department of a research-intensive university, it behooves us at the press to offer authors options to comply with funder mandates, not the least given the cost of APCs at the prestige high-impact journals where RU faculty frequently publish their research. 85% of the revenue that supports the press comes from subscriptions. These sustain our operations, including our high level of editorial and production service. Our subscriptions keep our Gold OA APC price below cost. Any surplus that the press delivers is returned back to the university. For our costs, 60% of those are actually staff-related, salary and benefits, travel to scientific conferences, institutional site visits, and society memberships. So our editorial process. So our 3 hybrid journals are editorially selective. They publish about 13% of the manuscripts that are submitted to them. Editorial decisions are made through a collaboration between PhD staff, editorial staff, and editorial boards of research active scientists. Some at RU, many beyond. Responsibility for editorial decisioning actually rests with the academic editors, the members of those boards. We pioneered image screening. In fact, Rob O'Donnell, who's sitting in the audience with me here, just recently spoke about this at RU. So all manuscripts are screened for image integrity by staff who have decades of experience and now supported by commercially available tools. For those manuscripts which are declined for reasons of novelty at our 3 hybrid journals, authors are offered the opportunity to transfer their manuscript to Life Science Alliance, the journal that we co-own with Embo and Cold Spring Harbor Press, and they are extended either a commitment to peer review or a commitment to publish with revisions as needed. Those authors may also receive a link to enable non-consultative transfer to several other not-for-profit journals. So we do seek to try and find authors a home for their work. Our authors report 95% satisfaction with both our editorial, our production and marketing services. We know this through surveys that we dispatch to our corresponding authors shortly after publication. So that's a little bit about our process. So our history of open and public access at RUP. So since 2001, all research articles published in our 3 hybrid journals are made free to read 6 months after publication under a CC BY NCSA license. And in 2017, we introduced a gold open access option following Bill and Melinda Gates mandating an OA. So that's where we were. Where are we headed? First of all, I'll give you some context. So 30% of the articles we publish in our hybrid journals acknowledge a Coalition S member. About 60% acknowledge funding from NIH or another federal funder. I will note that articles can cite acknowledge more than one funder, so HHMI and NIH. So you can actually add those numbers up. About 20% of the articles we publish have a corresponding author based in Asia. Currently, about 40% of the research articles we publish are published published open access under a CC BY license, and about half of those are covered by read and publish agreements. And we automatically, through our processes, waive gold APCs for corresponding authors from low or middle income countries. They need not apply for a waiver, it's built into our systems. So, recognizing the changes that are coming afoot, Rockefeller University commissioned an industry consultant sitting in this room. They have allowed me to out them, so maybe I will, to take an audit and analyze our journals and recommend actions for us to sustain our operations and continue to deliver that high level of service that our authors expect and recognize. And so, business model. Well, as recommended by Clark and Esposito, our consultant, and with the support of our university, our 3 hybrid journals are going to remain hybrid journals for the foreseeable future. Authors will have the option to publish immediate OA for a fee or covered by a read and publish agreement, or they will be empowered to be able to deposit their editorially accepted manuscript in a thank you for the rhyme, Nick, in a funder repository. Basically, we looked at this and we said that flipping to gold OA it's not going to be strategically or financially work for us. We'd either have to publish 4 times the amount of volume, or we'd have to increase our APC close to those of some of those commercial publishers. We were intrigued by Subscribe to Open, and I commend those that are going that way, but we also felt it was risky, specifically looking at Asia and concerned that we would lose those cancellations. And so we thought that what we would do is sit back and see how those who are pioneering this initiative fare. So I look forward for hearing from my other 2 panelists, because I think you are diving in there. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. Penelope.
Okay, great. Do I need to do anything to turn this? Hello? Hello? Can I switch with you? Okay, is that better? Yes. All right, thank you. All right, first test. So first of all, I'd like to also thank Amy and Rachel and the rest of the panelists for allowing me to be part of this panel. Really interested already in what I've heard today, and I'm looking forward to hearing more and having more of this discussion. So I'm going to build a little bit on what Rachel started with in her intro and talk about a mix of business models and the perspective from AIP Publishing, which is where I'm Chief Publishing Officer and have been for about 3.5 years now, and build a little bit on some of those themes as well. So just to give you a brief introduction to AIP Publishing, we're the publishing arm of the American Institute of Physics, which is a federation of physics and physical science societies. Like many of the organizations up here and probably represented in the audience, we're a not-for-profit organization. We are highly mission-driven, and our mission is to advance, promote, and serve the physical science community for the benefit of humanity by breaking barriers to open, equitable research communication and empowering researchers to accelerate global progress. And I read that because breaking barriers to open and equitable research communication is really embedded within our mission. We do this, carry out this mission through publishing roughly 24 AIP Publishing proprietary journals. We also partner with a number of different publishing partners, different societies in the physical science space to publish an additional 15 or so journals. So over the past 4-ish years at AIPP, we've really been undergoing a transformation, both to grow and strengthen our journals program, as well as to really transform and embrace an open science future. Our vision for an open science future at AIPP is one that's pragmatic, sustainable, and researcher-focused. So we carry those principles with us in everything that we do. We've determined at AIPP that in order to carry out this and embrace this vision, that we need to experiment and sustain a mix of different business models. So as a mission-driven organization, we also want to support models that support our mission while also accelerating science. So sometimes this creates polarities. Some models might be perhaps easier to implement or financially more lucrative, but they aren't always equitable or inclusive or researcher-focused. So there's often a tension that we're up against that creates another set of complexities. Of course, we support the APC model, as many of us do, and we've recently introduced fully gold open access journals that are supported through APCs paid by authors. We also recognize, however, that this model is not equitable across the research community, as we've all sort of been dealing with, and that they create a lot of these unintended consequences that come from coupling article volume growth to revenue growth. So our most recent experiments in terms of open science and open access business models have been ones that try to diversify beyond APC-based models. So most recently in 2024, we introduced Subscribe to Open through two of our largest journals in the portfolio, one of our flagship journals, the Journal of Applied Physics, as well as Physics of Plasmas. That experiment is going well, I would say, but it's also very early days. And we've also introduced an institutional gold open access model where essentially we're negotiating with institutions to pay a fixed price for unlimited publication in our open access journals. We also continue to support existing models. These include about 35 read and publish deals globally, which represents hundreds of institutions worldwide. We publish 3 Diamond open access journals, which are co-sponsored between us and a partnering institution. The most recent of these was launched this year in 2024. And of course, we maintain our hybrid subscription journals and the open access fees to allow authors to publish OA there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges in supporting this variety of mixed business models. We are a small to maybe medium-sized publisher, you can consider us. And this has really been a full-scale mindset and cultural transition for our organization that we've been undergoing. So we're essentially supporting both B2B as well as B2C models and operating in this mixed economy. I agree with Rachel that I think this is a situation that we're going to be in for quite some time. And so we've sort of embraced that we're going to be in this transition period, perhaps for a decade or more. It's not a matter necessarily of getting from point A to point B and how quickly can we accelerate. I think we're going to be in this situation where we have to support a mix of business models in order to carry out our mission and also continue to be sustainable. So as far as this transformation goes, I'm really not exaggerating when I say that this has been, what's been required is a full-scale transformation. We've invested a lot of resources and time and energy into the mindset and cultural shifts that have needed to happen in order to enable the support of these different business models, as well as the different business strategies that we're embracing. We've had to do this both internally with our internal teams, as well as externally with our stakeholders, our editors, and also our publishing partners and the societies for whom we publish. We're still undergoing this transformation, so it's definitely a work in progress. The support of these additional business models certainly comes with additional cost. We at AIPP have chosen to do this through running small tests and experiments. We didn't flip our full portfolio, for example, to S2O. We started out with 2 journals to see kind of how is that going. Our institutional open access deals that we're doing, we're piloting those with a few select institutional customers. And so out of necessity, I think sometimes the smaller players are the ones that have to experiment more to see what works for them. However, we have limited resources with which to do that. And so we know that we're going to have to experiment and then be ready to quickly pivot when those models or tests perhaps don't work out. So that's another thing I wanted to talk about is sort of the shifting sands. I think that it is a fallacy to think that we are moving from this to that, or we are replacing money that used to come here to money that used to go to money that will now go here. We see even with the models that we institute, so Subscribe to Open, for example, that model is built on the idea that you might be open one year and might not be open the following year. So I think there's a continual shifting sands that organization like ours has to be ready to embrace as well. And then, of course, there's other kind of technical challenges, things like infrastructure that we've had to invest in, regional differences in terms of the uptake of these different models and how we're dealing with that as well. The models, I would also say that the models we have been experimenting with have all been supported by publishers or researchers, institutions or libraries, or some combination of those. We have not necessarily yet seen much funder engagement, but we're starting to pursue that as well. So I think for me, the open questions that remain in terms of business models is what are the models that are going to allow for growth? And I think what we've heard in the keynote talk is there's a growing need, there's growth in the system in terms of the number of research articles that are being submitted and published every year, in terms of things like how many reviewers we need in order to peer review those articles, in terms of the amount of services that publishers need to provide with research integrity issues and ethical issues and so on. So there's growth that is needed. And I think what we found is that a lot of these models don't necessarily build in additional growth in the financial side either, which is required to, I think, continue to make these sustainable.
Is that one working now? Okay, this one's not working.
Oh, do you want this one?
I broke them.
Is this one working? Oh, it is working. It's come back. Thank you.
Hello.
Right. Thank you very much, Penelope, and over to you then, Collette.
Is this working?
Yes.
Okay, great. well, thanks, everyone. It's really lovely to see some familiar faces and close colleagues over the years, and I appreciate the invitation. A little bit about the American Physiological Society. We're a nonprofit society and publisher of 16 journals. And importantly, as a nonprofit organization, we reinvest everything from our publishing portfolio back into our operations and into the mission that we serve to really ensure that the discipline of physiology thrives well into the future. And we've had a long history with open access, like many of those on the panel. We were an earlier adopter of making our content available with a rolling embargo on our platform. We have made an optional open access option available for our authors for many years. We also have sponsored an education journal that's both free to read and free to publish. And about 10 years ago, we launched our first gold open access journal in partnership with our sister society, the Physiological Society. That's a sound science journal. And 5 years ago, we launched another open access journal that is intended to be much more selective. I joined APS about 5 years ago. I just had my 5-year anniversary, actually. And when I joined, I was actually quite surprised to see that the amount of open access content that we were publishing was very low. It was about 2%. And so we really embarked on a journey at that time to start thinking about how we move that needle and how we start to make progress. And we introduced a number of new initiatives. We launched our own version of transformative agreements called Read, Publish, and Join that integrated membership for any corresponding author at an institution that was subscribing and participating. We underwent a large number of educational and awareness campaigns for our stakeholder communities to really educate people about the benefits of open access and how it can really open doors and accelerate research. But even with all of that activity, growth of open access in our portfolio has been really very low, about 3% a year. So we're still under about 15%. And so when we were thinking about how to move forward, we had a number of considerations that many of my colleagues here have described. One is that we are a small organization. We are considered a small publisher in terms of revenue and size of journals. And, I often say that we have a very small but mighty team. And so anything that we do really has to take into consideration the resources that we have available. We also are not a high volume publisher, and we never will be. And that makes a big difference in the kind of models that are going to be sustainable for an organization. And then in many of the discussions that we had with our member leaders, there was a tremendous amount of concern about equity and access challenges for certain open access models that have become prevalent. While many of our members and authors are very well funded, R01 funded, we also have many authors and members who are not, who are at small institutions or early career researchers that simply could not afford the expensive article processing charges, and we predicted that we would have to charge a much higher rate than we are currently charging with our hybrid option. So all of these issues really came into play, and Penelope mentioned the issues around investment. We also needed a model that would enable us to continue to invest in our portfolio. The amount of change in our industry is significant. And we also really felt passionate about the value of the version of record as being what we want to promulgate in the community. And so any model that we were really going to back, we wanted to really focus on that as the real strong benefit. And of course, long-term financial sustainability, because of the fact that so much of what we do as a publishing organization goes back to fund our organization. So where are we going? We are announced earlier this year that we are going to adopt the subscribe to open model for our 10 self-published primary research journals. We are going to begin this pilot in 2025. And basically how subscribe to open works is that it transforms the foundations of a library subscription model to facilitate open access. There are no article processing charges for open access. And if enough institutions agree to participate and continue to subscribe, APS will commit to making our content of open access in that year under a Creative Commons license. And one of the really important components of this model is conditionality. So without it, the model begins to break down very quickly. And so if we don't receive enough funding in that year, we will continue to keep the journals gated, and we will continue to chase subscription income and make our content available to those who subscribe. And we will enable other avenues for our authors to meet their funder requirements, including green for many of our authors. We do have a twist on our version of Subscribe to Open as well, where we have an open access publishing guarantee for any of our customers who are part of a package. So we have two packages that we offer. One is called the Digital Library, which is all of our journals. And then we have a smaller package, which is a subset of our journals, our American Journal of Physiology set of journals, which is 7 of our journals. So if you're an author at one of the institutions that is participating in one of our packages, you will receive an OA guarantee no matter whether or not we transition in that year. And so, this is a pilot. It is an experiment. We felt that one of the benefits of moving in this direction with an open access guarantee is that it will really help us make significant progress. Even in a year that we don't perhaps transition a journal, we will still have more open access content than we do today. And so we felt that it would really help us really begin to move the needle in an important way. And so I'm happy to report back over the coming years. We don't expect that this is something that's going to be an overnight thing. We think it's going to take multiple years, 2-3 years, to really start to make a difference. And if it doesn't work, we'll need to pivot. And that's something that we're being very honest and open. But we've also felt that it's much easier to pivot from a model like this than to pivot from a gold open access model, because it really backs you into a corner if it doesn't work. And so with that, I will hand it back.
Thank you, Collette. Okay, so we have a little bit of time for questions. One thing I did just want to comment on was that you've heard from a panel of primarily not-for-profit publishers and obviously our librarian representative. And I think one thing that we think goes without saying, but I think we probably should say it anyway, is that we're here to serve the researchers. You know, we are, obviously our organizations need to be financially viable. We have members as well. We have 50,000 members for the American Physical Society. We run the world's biggest physics conference. So we serve meeting attendees as well. And there's a huge amount of additional work that we do in advocacy and education and programs that are often free or very low cost to the physicists that we serve. So I know without even asking the rest of my colleagues here that they would say the same thing. This is what we do. And I think a lot of what we hear about when we think about publishing is, you know, the sort of gouging of the publishing industry, and we hear a lot about, you know, the profit margins and so on. But I think what we're actually really all about is serving our communities well. And that's where we are now beginning to find that that's a struggle if you're a smaller not-for-profit organization, because the new models are squeezing the money out of the system. So I'm sure we will have some questions. We've got a whole set of questions, but I actually don't want to just be talking all the time, because what we'd really love to do is hear from you. So if anybody in the audience has got questions, either for individuals on the panel or just the panel as a whole, I think we might have a roving mic somewhere. Do we have a roving mic? Oh, okay. So if you could, yes, the lady in the yellow jacket, I don't know your name. Please introduce yourselves first.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for your really interesting perspectives. My name is Yamini Dalal. I'm an investigator at the NIH, but I serve on many editorial boards, and I've been very curious about why it costs more to do open access in the digital world compared to the old-fashioned publishing, where you had a publisher and you had a press and you had to have grounds to publish the journal, right? You don't have any of those expenses anymore, presumably, except if you're still hybrid. I'm wondering if I'm curious to hear your perspectives going into the future when we go completely digital. Do you anticipate that you could drop those fees significantly if you didn't have any ground costs other than salaries for people? I'd really love to hear more about that. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, is this working? I'm happy to start. You would be surprised at how expensive digital technology is. We do continue to print. We print all of our journals, actually, primarily because we have a customer base that still wants that. But the investments that are associated with publishing platforms, submission systems, billing systems, and all of that additional infrastructure to support open access capabilities, just even the ability to support an open access guarantee is requiring significant technological developments in order to make sure that it's a seamless, automated workflow. So you'd be quite surprised that it is not an inexpensive proposition, and costs, just like in, when you go to the grocery store, costs continue to go up every year. It's the same with publishing. And so we have not observed the kind of sort of significant decline in costs that you might imagine. And so I would not anticipate that as a progression towards a fully digital world continues, that you will see and observe publishers having the ability to significantly cut their costs. That's my own personal guess.
Anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, our printing costs are actually a fraction of our overall operating expenses. And so the costs that have been growing quite significantly are where we invest most heavily is in the peer review process. So, things like selecting editors, all of the infrastructure that goes around that. And all of that, while it's digital and electronic, we have hosting platforms and submission platforms. All of these are, technology infrastructures. Those all have an enormous amount of investment that's required to uphold, maintain, and continue to sustain them. And I think the other thing I would say is that, we've been talking a little bit about some of these unintended consequences, not necessarily for open access, but maybe in the way that we've implemented it through APCs. And the idea of coupling growth to article volume growth, that has injected or maybe amplified some of the problems that we've seen in the past. So things like research integrity, paper mills, and so on that were mentioned in the previous talks. And so that is requiring now even more investment than we as publishers had made previously as well. And I think a lot of that investment is coming to the publisher because we're the ones who are sort of the last gatekeepers before these papers are published. So trying to figure out how to spread out those costs as well, I think is really critical to the success of this enterprise.
Thank you. Any other comments before we take?
I was just going to second what my two colleagues have said, and I've been in publishing a long time. So back when I started, we used to mail out manuscripts for peer review and the like. And so the investments that we've all made in our peer review systems have actually helped speed up the process and get that research published more quickly. And also to add on to Penelope's comment about the screening and integrity tools that we now have at our disposal, these are great, but they come with a cost.
Thank you.
And if I could just quickly add, in the print age, there were a lot of profits and margins made on publishing, and in the digital age, there's profits and surpluses made on all of this. So whether that's 20%, 30%, or 40%, that has not changed. So if it's a $3,000 APC, 900 of that is surplus or profit going to, the society's operating budget or going to shareholders. So there's a piece of that pie that is not going to change one way or another because we are funding so many other things off of these revenue flows.
Thank you. Now, I'm not sure who was up first. Oh, the lady on the right.
Hi, I'm Sarah Whalen. I'm the Director of Open Research Americas at Wiley. And I just wanted to say thank you to the panelists for sharing your models. It's really interesting. And a question for the group, does anyone have plans to report back a year or two out on the success of these experiments? I think that could be really useful for the progress of the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I can start. Yes, with Subscribe to Open, there's a community of practice for Subscribe to Open, and transparency and reporting is a really critical component to the model. And so we will be reporting on an annual basis which of our journals have transitioned, which have not for that year. And it will make that publicly available. So, and that's part of the beauty of the community of practice is that we're also sharing across all of the organizations that have been experimenting with this model so they can learn from it and continue to fine tune it. So yes.
Thank you.
Same.
Oh, no, please go ahead. Sorry.
No, yes. Basically, yes, the same. The same.
The short answer
Ditto.
is yes.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something to that?
No, that's it. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I think a part of this actually conference, I think, is all about let's collect data, let's start understanding what we need to research, let's look at the outcomes and let's share them. So I think it was a really relevant question. Thank you. I'm not sure who was next. Right, okay. It's very gentlemanly.
So Bodo Stern from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute.
Hi, Bodo.
Hi. I want to go back to Adam Jeffy's presentation and ask you about his idea of separating dissemination and evaluation. And I'm asking because the publishers on the panel have described themselves as small or medium-sized publishers, and publishing is a volumes game. I noticed that it was a little bit negatively tinted that it is a volumes game, but we want scientists to publish all the science that is worth publishing. That includes a lot more than what editors find interesting. So it is as a public good thing, it is a volumes game, and that is a challenge for nonprofit publishers, and as you have all described. So have you thought about this concept that you, as adding quality, are dissociating that quality from the actual dissemination? And that could, of course, work through preprint servers, that you are building on what preprint servers publish, and that you come on top with your value-added work. That is then not limited anymore to this small slice that you actually currently publish. Is there a way that you can look into business models in that direction?
Thank you. Who wants to take that one?
So my original question that I was going to share was, because my background is in research, so I was a physical chemist researcher before I came into publishing. And so I keep that very close with, and I'm sure many of the publishers in this room have a similar background. But my original question was, what is the business model and also the publication model that's really going to allow us to fulfill the missions that we have, right? Which is really to advance scientific research, support researchers, and support and accelerate research. And I think that some of the comments from, the keynote today, as well as others, where it's thinking about, do we want to publish more and then have a layer of curation? And is that, perhaps a new model that we can use? I think we do need to be open to some of these other publication models, and then also what are the business models that can help support that, and not just from the publisher side, but also collectively, because I think that's another, very significant theme, is that none of us stakeholders is going to be able to do this alone. This is about a collective participation in terms of how do we accelerate and advance scientific research.
Yeah, I'm happy to add. So my question, or that I didn't mention earlier, really had to do with what changes need to be made in the reward and evaluation system in order to really, change the incentives. And I think that is really the critical piece. If we began to experiment with those models, and I'm watching eLife's model very, very closely and very interested to see how they do and how much uptake they receive, because I think that's the closest to what you've described. But ultimately, without changes in the reward and incentive system, I think it'll be very difficult, because if academia still really requires those final publications in high impact factor journals, let's just be honest, then those kinds of models that decouple it become more and more complicated to execute on.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Actually, can I just add to that? We as an organization, that's exactly how we feel about this as well. We've just removed journal names from our assessment materials. We have included preprints, so we are moving in that direction to reward scientists for sharing their work and for having open peer review, for example, and de-emphasizing the signals that are coming from the final version, and that should be an encouragement also for the publishers to move along and offer those kinds of services.
Well, I would add that in the physics community, we've been using arXiv for a really long time.
Yes.
And it's almost everything that we publish is on arXiv as well in some form or another, and so that's just ingrained in the physics communities. I know it's not quite the same in other communities, although preprints are growing in the biomedical sciences as well and in chemistry. But that's just part of the process already. I understand the philosophy that you're mentioning, though, Bodo, which is about de-emphasizing the journals and layering services onto preprints rather than having the journal as the brand. And sorry, Susan. Yes.
And I was just going to add, for our journals, we're up to about 50% of authors who are choosing to preprint, 50% are not. And when I talk to researchers, what I find is that they're selective in what they choose to preprint or not. There are some things that they will and some things that they wouldn't. And the only other observation I have, I was struck with Adam's use of wording, I think, on his last slide, where he talked about curation and dissemination. And I think one of the questions is, when does that curation happen? Does it happen before dissemination or after dissemination, which I think is one of the reasons I'm intrigued by the eLife model. So.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Albert Hinman. I work for the House Committee on Science-Based Technology. Earlier from your conversations, you were talking about one, that this mixed business models are going to be around for a while. And then you're also, I think one of the panelists brought up that you're engaging the funders right now. But since the rollout of the memo, agencies have been working to stand up their own interpretation and implementation of the public access plans. And I was wondering, on terms of engagement, or if you're looking at National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, NIH, are there any sort of differences in those plans? Are you worried about flexibilities to support your different models that you have for your enterprises? What keeps you awake at night? We'd love to know.
Good question.
Oh, lots of things keep me awake at night. But I mean, I guess, and it was a point I wanted to make earlier on, we can support all of these models, all of the diversity, the facts and figures that I gave you about where our authors are publishing and where they're funded from. You can check these yourselves because, and this is because of the robust metadata that we apply to all of our content. So I think it is challenging to support these models, but if you've got that those PIDs there, it makes it an awful lot easier. I don't know if that answered your question, but knowing that we've got that metadata helps me sleep at night and in the shifting sands that we are facing.
Other thoughts? I think there's a lot of similarities between the policies that are emerging and that people have been invited to comment on. And so I think there are in different fields, there are different senses of how much it will impact you. So in the physical sciences, I think it's very different to in the life and biomedical sciences. But I think we're all aware that the deadline is looming and you need to be able to enable your authors to be compliant. So it's sort of top of everybody's agendas is how can we make sure we do that? And we're not excluding parts of the community. Yes.
Yeah, Chris Markham. I want to go back a bit to Adam Jaffe's, one of his points in here on the value proposition of publishing, and to ride along on some of what Curtis Brundy and some others have said here about transparency in the surplus revenues, right? And so you can imagine that if there's value proposition to be had, that extra surplus revenue that the small scholarly societies and small publishers are reinvesting back in the community makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of value added there, and I agree with Curtis that you're all providing great service to the community. But if the value proposition is that I pay a $10,000 APC and 4,000 of that goes directly into, say, my shareholders, is that a value proposition that researchers should take home to their communities and say, like, look, I'd much rather have that money go back into the community rather than into some profit machine?
Well, first up, I don't think any of us have got a $10,000 APC here, but yes, the point is taken. I mean, I think all of the information is publicly available for not-for-profits on where the money gets spent, and I think increasingly for us, we're having to. That margin shrinks because we've got so much infrastructure change to make. So we know over the next few years that it isn't going to be that because we're investing in our systems, in our platforms, in our author experience, in Diamond OA journals, actually. So it will reduce. But I mean, I think it's a fair question that you're asking. And I mean, others on the panel may have views and comments on that as well.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. One is that I think for an author, that is a decision that an author has to make. What do they view as the value of the service that they are receiving? And it goes back to that whole rewards and incentives thing. If you're publishing in a highly selective, big brand journal that's going to help advance your career, you may think that investment is worth it, even if a percentage of the money is going to shareholders. And that's a personal decision. For us, like as Rachel said, we don't have really expensive article processing charges, but we do. Back about 4 or 5 years ago, when I first joined APS, we launched a program called Publish with Purpose, and it was really all about this concept around how are you encouraging your community to support nonprofit publishers like APS, and really making a purposeful decision as an author to support nonprofit organization. And so I think that's really important, but I think reward and incentive programs at the academic level will also have an impact there.
And I was just going to second what Collette said. It has to be an author's choice. And I think, if I recall from a recent report from Clark and Esposito, both Elsevier and Springer Nature have grown in the number of published articles. So one may not like it, but many authors are choosing to support those companies.
So I sort of alluded to this transformation, cultural transformation that we're undergoing at AIPP, as we transform to open science and open access, more progressive open access as well. And I think that transparency is a big part of that. I think a lot of our information as a not-for-profit is already out there, but we're also thinking about how can we be more purposeful about that transparency as well, and deliver kind of information that would be helpful to show the value and also help to make our stakeholders make better decisions as well.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one quick question and maybe a couple of brief responses from the panel, just to keep everything on track.
How quick?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I think we keep going back to Adam's question because the challenges we face are largely systemic. I'm Jonathan Starr. I'm with DSci Labs. I also work with NumFocus, which does fiscal sponsorship for scientific Python stack. I also have been spending the past 10 years building technical infrastructure to enable what Adam described, and it largely works at this point. It's new infrastructure. It's modifying incentives from incentives to PIDs to publishing pipelines. So I'm curious, and it's come up a couple times with some of your answers, how beholden are your experiments with business models dependent on the technical infrastructure to which you have access?
Thank you. Good question.
Highly beholden.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why S2O in some regards can be very attractive, because there's perhaps less infrastructure that's needed or needed to be replaced, and workflows and so on and so forth. But yes, I agree. A lot of it, we have a lot of legacy systems that are built on either a print model or a institutional subscription model. So yes, I think technical infrastructure is a big part of this as well.
Absolutely agreed, and that's why I'm so delighted to have Rob O'Donnell in the audience, who sorts out all our metadata on our platforms. But yes, without that, it would be very difficult to support the multitude of models that are out there and may come to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just quickly from a library perspective, we're not running the technology, but libraries, as they look at shifting this historic collection spend, are more and more, we don't talk about collection development. I feel like the more progressive libraries are thinking of our spending as open investing. And what are we investing in? And it feels sometimes a little bit odd just to peel off like the open access piece of it, because really what we're trying to do is be strategic and thinking about a portfolio of investments across open infrastructure, which can be the technology that undergirds a lot of what we need to do. It's certainly the open access, but it's the open data, it's our open education work, it's open advocacy. So I just wanted to leave that there is a transition going underway, not just with publishers, but also with libraries, and how we envision and think about spending this money and what it should be going to support. And I should not just say libraries, institutions, because these are being supported in the conversations being had across the institution about where this money should go.
That's a really important point, thank you. So on that note, I'll stick to my timing, and I'd just like to thank the panel for their contributions. Thank you.